right. Welcome to Choosing, Planting, and Protecting the Ideal Seedling for Your Site. My name is Amber Jungwirth, and I'm with the Minnesota DNR, Cooperative Forestry Management Forester, and I'm based out of the Hibbing area, so in the northeastern zone of Minnesota. So today I'm going to cover some topics about why is it important to choosing the right tree species for your site, the proper planting techniques, and then finally protecting your seedlings. So why is it important to give good consideration to what tree species you are going to put on your site? You want to look at the soils because not all tree species grow well on every sort of soil. So if you have a sandy soil versus a heavier clay loam or a peat, that's going to determine which species does best there. What are your water levels? Are you in a high water table level where the water is just a couple inches below the surface, or is it more of an average location? The landscape location, if you're in the uplands or the lowlands, it's important to know that and give it good consideration. And then of course, what are your planting objectives? Are you looking for wildlife habitat with mass production or thermal cover, or are you looking for timber production? Or are you looking for a possibility of creating a sound barrier from a highway or a windbreak? And then of course, what kind of follow-up work are you able to give to that planting? Some species are going to require follow-up work like timber stand improvement and protection from wildlife browse. So the state of Minnesota is fairly large, and I was going to go over species by zones of our state, but then there would be a lot of overlap. So I'm just going to cover individual species, and there'll be a nice map in the corner that shows you what's their natural range. So we won't have quite as much overlap. So we have 53 native species within the state of Minnesota, but not all species require planting after harvest, or if you're trying to fill in a pasture or a hayland. So I'm going to cover just species that are commonly used in our planting proposals. And I'm going to start with our conifers. So here is our white cedar. They're predominantly in northern Minnesota naturally. They prefer moist sites where you might have a high water table or stony ground, so like up the North Shore. They're shade tolerant, so if the seedlings can take root in that understory, they will be able to just kind of hang out there until an opening occurs in the canopy and the sunlight comes in, and they will be able to start growing rather quickly. They do require protection from wildlife browse. And as you can see in the map in the lower right-hand corner, the blue counties are the counties where it's found naturally. That's their native range. But if you live outside those counties, it doesn't mean that you can't plant the seedlings and see how they do. And that's common for all of our trees. So next is our white pine. The natural range is northern, central, and eastern Minnesota. You can also find it scattered along the Mississippi River as far south as Houston County. They do best on fertile, well-drained soils, but they also will thrive on sandy soils. They have a couple insect and disease issues, white pine blister rust and white pine tipweevil, and they of course will require protection from browse. Jack pine is normally in the northern, central, and northeastern Minnesota. They thrive on our nutrient-poor sandy soils, but they'll do well in upland sites that have heavier soils, and you also find them in the lowland bogs, thriving right next to black spruce. They're shade tolerant, and they also need protection from browse. Our state tree, red pine, often referred to as Norway pine, is normally in northern, central, and northeastern Minnesota. They prefer a sandy loam or dry rocky ridges. They're shade intolerant, so if we're going to be planting them, we want to make sure we have a nice open site with not a lot of competition. And then they'll require a little bit of TSI throughout their life in the early years, because we don't want that competition to be overtopping them and shading them out. And if that does occur, those Norway pine will kind of stagnate in their growth, and they'll usually, most commonly, they don't survive. And so we'll want to make sure that we keep that area kind of open around them until they get into like their 20s. They're also going to need protection from browse. So we'll move into our black spruce. This species isn't often planted. It's usually in the bogs, and so we'll do aerial seeding, but it also can be planted in the uplands. And it's usually found in northern, northeastern Minnesota in our nutrient poor bogs or our richer peat swamps. These seedlings are shade tolerant, and so if you walk into a thick conifer stand, you will commonly see the advanced regeneration in the understory, just kind of hanging out, putting a little bit of growth on every year, waiting for the openings to occur. We do have to worry about dwarf mistletoe in our black spruce stands. That's a parasitic plant that will grow on the adult trees. And as that plant grows, it'll eventually kill the trees, and then they rain their spores down on the understory. And so if you have a heavily infected stand, you'll usually have these open pockets within the stand, and there'll be no regeneration there. So that is a concern. White spruce is our upland spruce found in northern Minnesota all the way down to the St. Croix Valley. And they can do well on dry soils with our pines, our moist soils, and you can also find them in swamps. So they're very adaptive. Most commonly, we'll plant them in that transition zone where it's a little wetter because our pines won't do as well there. So that's a good location for them. They're intermediately shade tolerant, and they do have a spruce sawfly insect that will attack them when they're in their early stages of growth. And finally, we have our deciduous conifer, the beloved tamarack, which is found in northern Minnesota all the way down to the Twin Cities. It can be planted in urban landscapes. It does well on dry soils, moist soils, and swamps. And it's shade intolerant. So most commonly, you'll see these guys popping up in our lowlands much quicker than our black spruce do, and they put on a lot of growth in a short amount of time. Although they do, we are seeing large die-offs from the larch beetle in northern Minnesota, so we are currently working on finding ways to address regenerating those sites. So that is a concern for us. So now I'm going to move on to our deciduous trees. And we'll start with the bur oak, which is common throughout the entire state. They prefer moist soils that are well drained, but they will grow in heavier soils in our prairies. And I've even seen them up in Koochiching County in black spruce swamps. So they're pretty adaptive as well. They're moderately shade tolerant, and they do grow rather slowly. So it'll take a long time for them to get to be a mature tree. And their common disease that is kind of popped up in the last couple of years, we've seen it more prevalent, is the bur oak blight. It's kind of an aesthetic fungus that increases during wet springs, and it just causes the leaves to turn brown, and over time they'll regenerate, or they'll reflush their leaves, and so they don't usually die off because of bur oak blight. Red oak grows throughout much of the state, but it does grow best in the southern 2/3. We have red oak in the northern part of the state, but it doesn't do as well because of the cold winters. They're usually much smaller and have plenty of frost cracks in them. They like moist soils that are well drained. They're moderately shade tolerant. They're faster growing than their bur oak sisters. And one of the big drawbacks is that they're very susceptible to oak wilt, which we have in southern Minnesota, and it is slowly creeping northwards. So that's a concern. You want to make sure you know the symptoms of what oak wilt looks like so that you can take action to try to stop the spread of that. White oak is abundant from the Twin Cities and south, and it's not adapted to fire, so that's why you don't see it in the western part of the state. They prefer heavy, well-drained soils, but they also do well on our moist soils to dry soils. So they're pretty adaptive. They can grow on any of the soils pretty much. They're moderately shade tolerant, and much like our bur oak, they are also slow growing. All of our oaks are actually susceptible to oak wilt, but the white oak family is not quite as susceptible as the red oak. Swamp white oak is primarily in the river bottoms of southeastern Minnesota and the southern parts of the Minnesota River Valley. They prefer those moister soils. They're moderately shade tolerant. They also grow slowly and are susceptible to oak wilt. Bitter Bitternut hickory is primarily south of Mille Lacs and infrequently up the Mississippi Valley, or excuse me, Mississippi and the tributaries of the St. Louis River. And there's also some natural isolated populations in Itasca County. So if you are looking to possibly have some trial trees planted on your property in northern Minnesota with the warmer climates, bitternut hickory is probably a good choice for that. They prefer rich, moist soils, and they're shade tolerant, and they're moderately slow growing, so a little bit slower. But shagbark hickory, on the other hand, is already in its or at its northern edge of its natural range in southeastern Minnesota, so you probably won't find that too far north of the Twin Cities. But they also like rich, damp soils. They prefer to be along streams or hillsides, and they're shade tolerant. Black walnut is in southern Minnesota. Natural range extends up to the Twin Cities, but has been planted as far as north as the Arrowhead region. So this is also another species that if you're looking to possibly increase diversity for our warming climate, this could be a good fit for you. It does well on drier soils, but if you have average rainfall, and it's not too wet of a site, they will do just fine there. They're moderately shade intolerant, but they do kind of grow a little bit faster than some of our other species. River birch is primarily something in southern Minnesota. It thrives on the rich bottomlands of streams and rivers in the Mississippi and Root River Valley. This is a floodplain species. And so if you have a lower area or seeps or anything like that, this is a species that's going to really do well there. It's shade tolerant, so that it can be planted under a canopy or under a partial canopy. If you had just like a thinning done, you wanted to increase your species diversity, it would be a great fit for that. And it's also moderately fast growing. Hackberry is the last species I'm going to cover. And it's also one of those species that you could introduce further north if you're looking to diversify and plan for warming climate. It's naturally found in southern to western Minnesota, all the way up to the Red River Valley. It's naturally found in floodplain forests, but it will grow in most forest types. I've actually seen it planted up here in our boulevards in a couple of our cities in St. Louis County. So it does grow up here. It's shade tolerant and moderately fast growing. So like I said earlier, we have a lot of different species in Minnesota, but some of them don't need to be replanted. They'll seed naturally, or they'll sprout out from the root systems. So these species are just ones that we commonly plant in our regeneration plans. So now that we kind of have an idea of what species we might be planting, we should talk about how to plant them and what we should use to plant them. So planting is kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You want to make sure that you have it just right. So if we plant our seedlings too deep or too shallow, they aren't going to thrive. They could die, or they could sit there for quite a while before they start putting growth on. So in the first picture, you can see that that seedling is planted entirely too deep. The lateral roots are quite a ways below the soil surface. And so those roots are going to struggle in order to get established. And the same thing goes with if it's too shallow, the lateral roots are actually above the soil ground in this picture. And so those roots are going to die, and the tree may or not be able to get enough roots going in the soil to survive. It's most likely going to die. So in the last one, you can see the laterals are in the top 2 inches of the soil, which is where we want them to be. And it appears to be planted correctly. The roots are facing downward. We don't want them to be looping back up towards the sky in a J, because the roots are going to grow in the direction that they are in the soil. So if they're facing upwards, they're going to continue to grow upwards. And if they grow up out of the ground, those roots are going to die from the air, and it's going to hinder your tree. So we want to take that into good consideration and make sure we're planting them correctly. So depending on what kind of site you have, if you have a pasture or a hayfield that you're going to be replanting, the tool on the left with the tractor and the planting machine is going to be the ideal fit for getting your trees in the ground. It will save you a lot of time. And essentially an individual will sit in the tree planter that's behind the tractor. They will put trees down into the planting shoe, and there'll be some packing or a shovel or a plow shoe that opens up the soil, and then some packing wheels that will close it back up around that seedling. And so it'll get planted and you can be done within a couple of hours. If you're planting after a timber harvest and you have roots, stumps, lots of rocks, you're going to want to use the orange planting bar. And that is what we're going to go through how to plant in the next slide. So in this picture, you can see that you're going to take the planting bar and plunge it into the soil. Make sure you have it deep enough that there's going to be enough space for all your roots. Kind of wiggle it back and forth to open up and create a hole. Then you put your seedling in, making sure all your roots are facing down. You don't want to be J-rooting or having roots up above the soil surface. And then you're going to want to move about 2 inches away from your open hole, plunge the soil or the planting bar back into the ground and push that soil up against the tree seedling's roots to ensure that you're closing up all the air gaps within that hole so that we don't have any air in there that's going to cause your roots to die. And then take your heel of your foot and kind of tap around the tree, shut the hole up if you can that you created with the planting bar, and then just stomp around the edge of the seedling. And then when you're done with that, just give the seedling a little tug, grab some needles on top or the stem, give it a little tug to make sure there's resistance to ensure that the seedling has been planted correctly. So now that we've talked about proper planting, we want to talk about ways that we can protect our seedlings. We just spent a ton of time planting all these seedlings. We want to make sure that they survive. So here are some options of how to protect the seedlings. Earlier in the presentation, I said most of our conifers need to be protected and our oaks definitely need to be protected. So if you're doing conifers, one of the best ways to protect them would be with bud caps. Essentially, you take a 2x4 inch piece of paper, you wrap it around the terminal leader of your seedling with the opening to the top so that in the spring when that bud breaks and they start to grow, they can just grow right up out of the paper. And then you staple it to the needles to try to reduce the chances that if a deer comes and gives it a tug, that it'll stay in place. The next is a planting or a netting. It's a rigid plastic tree tube essentially that kind of looks like fishnet, and you would use this primarily on deciduous trees. It is available in different diameters, so you possibly could get it big enough for our conifers, but you would place it over the seedling and thread a stake through it or maybe zip tie a post to it, and then that would protect that seedling. And then as the seedling grows, you have the opportunity to move that rigid tube up to continue to protect the seedling until it hits an appropriate height, which is usually around 6 feet. Then the deer can't reach them. And the final picture here is a tree tube. It's an older style. Our newer styles kind of have holes in them to allow airflow through them so that we don't have the greenhouse effect from the sun as it heats up the tube and it causes the tree to flush out early. So this is a product that will not only protect your seedling from deer browse, it will also protect them from voles and other rodents that will want to chew on your hardwood seedlings and girdle the stems. And finally, one of the final ways to protect your trees is individual tree cages. This obviously is most like an apple tree, but you can do the same for your white pine. They have a program up the North Shore that they're helping landowners purchase fencing to protect white pine up there. But essentially you want to get a 5 to 6 foot fence with multiple strong, sturdy posts and create an enclosure. So depending on how often you want to try to increase the enclosure, depending on the tree, which would also dictate how large you need to make that enclosure to begin with. You can also do this with larger enclosures and plant multiple trees in there. Say if you wanted to do multiple white pine or multiple oaks in, say, a 10 by 10 foot enclosure, you can do that as well. Then you definitely want to make sure you have a fence that's high enough that's going to prevent the deer from jumping in so that they don't consume those trees. So now throughout this presentation, we kind of covered why it's important to look at the condition of your site that you're going to be planting, which would dictate which trees are going to thrive in those sites. Consider the goal of your planting if you want to have wildlife cover, or if you want mass, or if you're going to want it for timber value. That would be important to decide before you get a planting plan in place. How much follow-up work you're going to be able to put into your stand. And then of course you want to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. So you can see in this picture on the right, they've got some white pine mixed in with some red oak. So it's probably a wildlife planting because you've got your thermal cover and your mass. So here's my contact information. Like I said, I'm located up in Hibbing, Minnesota. There's my email. And if you perhaps aren't within the Northeast region of Minnesota, I did include our website for forest stewardship on the Minnesota DNR. There's some links at the bottom of that page where you can look for your forester contact in your area. It'll bring up a map and you can choose whatever location you're located. Thank you.